Hey everyone, my name is Lizzie and today we'll be talking about how has my alcohol making process changed from the beginning to how it is now. So I must admit that after trial and error, you get to try new things, you see what works, what doesn't, you want to know what tastes better. And initially what I would do is use turbo yeast. So this was recommended. This was one of the first yeasts I saw on Amazon. Okay, I don't know if you see it there. And this includes yeast nutrients. So what's good about turbo yeast is that it accelerates the process. So instead of waiting, let's say 1 to 3 weeks to make your alcohol, you could do it in a few days, for example. Because turbo yeast is turbo. And yeast nutrients, what it does, it invigorates your yeast so it eats the sugar more rapidly. The only hinge is that there is an aftertaste. Initially, I did not notice an aftertaste, but after a few batches, I did, and it gives you a sort of bitterness that not all alcohol drinkers may want. If you prefer that, then fine, use turbo yeast by all means. There's absolutely no problem with that, but I decided to transfer yeast and use Daddy yeast afterwards. This is the Daddy yeast package. And I used this for a while until I decided to try something new. And now what I use is the wine yeast. The wine yeast here, EC1118. And I might use other yeast in the future. So I hear that there are some yeast that give you a sort of honey flavor, liquid yeast. Actually, I've never tried liquid yeast. I'm interested to know if some of you use it. So drop a comment below if you're one of those liquid yeast users, and is it better than powdered yeast? Is it more effective? Does it taste different? It probably tastes different because all yeast yield different flavors. So I'd be interested to know if there are recommended yeast out there that are liquid. If liquid is a better way to go, then I will try it without a doubt. Another change that I've gone through is my recipe. So initially, I just had this recipe. It was mainly by trial and error, but I would do 50% molasses with 50% sugar, and it was the only homemade alcohol that I've tasted, so it was a standard taste. I didn't know if it was good or bad, but to me it was drinkable. So I made my friends drink it, and they're all like, yeah, it's decent, but little did I know they were being polite because recently I found out that they actually like my new batches better. And the critique for having 50% molasses, 50% sugar is that it was either too sweet, there's an aftertaste of molasses, and you don't want that aftertaste, or you don't want it being too sweet either. So I adjusted it, and I adjusted it by accident. So what happened is that I was running out of molasses. I just had a little end of molasses inside the box, and I poured the rest in, and it was a really great recipe. Everyone loved that recipe. So I decided to reduce the amount of molasses inside the recipe, and here I am with a new recipe. So that's another thing that I've changed. And the third thing that I've changed is the emplacement of the fermentation jar inside a house. So initially I would have the fermentation jar, put the sugar, water, molasses inside a jar. I would sprinkle the yeast on top and put it in a dark room in the kitchen. But little did I know that this would not favor fermentation because the yeast is more active when it's warm. So the optimal temperature for yeast fermentation is 27 degrees Celsius. And therefore, I would move the jar from a dark, cold place in the kitchen to a nice and bright area in the living room that would be hotter. This would accelerate the alcohol making. And instead of waiting 4 weeks, I would wait 2 to 3 weeks. And it's always better to have things faster if you can. It doesn't affect the taste in a bad way. It doesn't affect the taste at all. It just affected the sugar fermentation. And if in case the fermentation did not start right away, so let's say I would put the yeast in and there were no bubbles. No bubbles in the airlock means there's something wrong. Usually people wait 2 to 3 days in order to see if there's bubbling, but if there's no bubbling after that time period, something's wrong. And what I would do, my first way to troubleshoot it after checking if the lid is screwed on tight, I would just put it in a room and blast the heating to the top. So the yeast would just get activated and it would force the yeast to do something, so to eat the sugar. So I'd put it there for maybe 7 hours in the blasting heat, and I would put it back in my living room. And that's when the fermentation, it had already started inside the blasting heat room, and it would just continue in the living room. So once it starts, it tends to go along. As long as you don't put it in like a fridge or a cold place in the garage, because that would make the yeast dormant. It would make the yeast fall to the ground and not eat yeast. Therefore, no alcohol will be produced. So the emplacement of the room is something that I changed. And if you want to know these little tips and tricks, where to place your alcohol, how to make your alcohol, we have classes in the link below. And it's getting colder these days. So let's say you don't want to get out of the house to buy alcohol, you can make it from home. We could do it from ingredients that you have in your pantry, including baker's yeast, water, as long as your water is drinkable, you're good. Sugar, you for sure have that. And that's all you need. You don't even need these fancy things like yeast, nutrients. That's a plus, but it's not necessary. If you want to make alcohol from the most basic ingredients, those are the main things you need. You don't even need juice. Honestly, sugar and water will do the trick. And the more natural your flavors are, the more chances you have of it actually working, because there's no preservatives, and preservatives may act against yeast. So you want to make sure to avoid that when possible. And I'll actually give you a bonus for alcohol making processes that change. So honestly, this is something that I should do, but I don't, is to use a yeast starter. And a yeast starter, what it is, it's just water, sugar, and you put the yeast on there and you wait. So you wait till the yeast gets activated, and once it's already active, that's when you put it in the fermentation jar. So it's already active and it'll just do its work and make alcohol. You can either put sugar water in that little container, or you take a part of your recipe with the solution. So use a portion from the fermenting jar, put it in a different container, a separate container, and you put the yeast in there. So it's already used to its future home, because that's just a preview of where it's going to be in for the next few weeks. So you put the yeast inside that home, inside that container, which is the ingredients from your big jar, put it in the small jar. And then once the fermentation starts, then you put that little jar, dump it in the big one, so the yeast is already active. By the way, once you do a yeast starter, it's open to oxygen. You don't close the jar. You just leave it out in the open. So I would suggest not to leave it in there for too long, not to pass 5 days, let's say, with yeast, sugar inside an open jar, because your alcohol might turn into vinegar if it's exposed to too much oxygen. We don't want vinegar, we want alcohol. And once you put it in the fermenting jar, it yields to the same exact result. So this is how professionals make sure they have the same results. So they tend to use a yeast starter, and it produces exactly the same product every time. So if you want consistency, if you like your taste, you want to make sure everything stays the same, a yeast starter is something that I would suggest. So if you found this video valuable, share with a friend. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.